In the early days of February 1855, freezing temperatures gripped the counties of Devon and Dorset, England, blanketing the villages and fields with a thick layer of unmelting snow. Residents of the rural communities in Devon would wake up on the 9th morning of the month to not only find a fresh blanket of white snow greeting them, but also the ominous hooved footprints of something walking on two legs having wandered through their town. In this episode, we delve into the time when the devil visited the County of Devon. Welcome back to the Moonlight Lore podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. In today's episode, we are delving into the story behind the devil's footprints, a strange phenomenon that, to this day, has perplexed the minds of those eager enough to try and solve its mystery. So, let's go back to the winter of 1855, where record-freezing temperatures tightened their icy grip on the coastal county of Devon. For both the month of January and the beginning of February, the residents of the County of Devon were experiencing one of the coldest winters they had in years, a harsh change from their idyllic sunny beach weather they were used to for majority of the year. But of course it was winter now, and a cold one at that. It had been relentlessly snowing for the past several days, but on the morning of February 9th, the citizens from the towns and villages all over were relieved to find the biting wind and snow had finally stopped at some point in the night. Although, something wasn't quite right. As people emerged from their homes in the morning, the obvious signs of hoofprints were found walking through several towns and fields. Now, this typically wouldn't be so strange, as the chance of a pony or goat or maybe even a deer wandering into town could have been pretty high. But when people began to gather around to further inspect and gawk at the prints in the snow, they found them to be incredibly off from what they'd first initially thought of them being simple animal tracks. First off, those few farmers in and around town did a quick head count and found their ponies and goats to be fully accounted for. So, maybe a little bit confused, the villagers took a closer look at the hoofprints. They found the prints to measure 4 inches long, 3 inches wide, and roughly to be between 8 to 16 inches apart from the previous step. This would make sense for it to possibly have been a wild deer who was brave enough to venture into town, but there was still something wrong with this thought. As is typical for deer and any other quadrupeds, their tracks are 2 feet on each side, leaving behind 4 offset prints in the dirt, mud, or in this case snow. Only thing was, it was obvious to everyone there these tracks weren't made by any deer. No, these hoof prints left behind in the snow weren't made by anything with 4 legs, but rather with just 2. It would seem whatever hoofed creature made its way through several towns and villages in Devon County in 1855 walked on 2 hooved feet. Citizens of the county were in bewilderment. What sort of creature had hooved feet but walked like a human, leaving 2 prints in the white ground, one in front of the other? Curiosity was killing everyone, and now a small posse had formed and people began following the trail in hopes of finding any clues that might solve their mystery. However, their quest for answers wouldn't bring them any closer to solving this phenomenon, and only offer up more questions than anything else. It didn't take long for the investigative villagers to find clues that whatever creature wandered through their town last night was something truly strange. As the posse followed closely, taking great care as to not step on or disturb the hoofprints or the snow around them, they were brought to a small wagon. Being met with this wooden, 4-wheeled, open-top wagon wasn't surprising, as it had been stuck here for several days due to the heavy snowfall that occurred in the past week. But what caught most people off guard was the hoofprints didn't walk around the wagon like one would have expected. No, the snow-covered wagon seemed to only act as an obstacle for the group of citizens and not whatever creature it was they were tracking. The hoofprints, with seemingly no effort at all, simply walked up to the wagon and walked onto it and crossed it. leaving no disturbed snow in the process that would indicate someone having climbed it with use of their hands, and continued on their way on the other side, walking further through town. This was the point where some of the townsfolk became maybe a little confused and also maybe a little spooked, as a few decided the mystery wasn't worth pursuing and figured if the rest of the group found what was at the end of the trail, surely they would hear about it later that day or the next. But undeterred, most of the posse continued on and imagined what strange creature they would find at the end of their journey. They continued to venture through town with wonderment in their minds and frozen fingers and breath. They traversed through the heavier snowdrifts, which proved to be fairly difficult for them, yet seemed to have been no issue for whatever it was that made the hoof markings in the snow. Eventually, though, they persevered and came face to face with a 2-story house near the edge of town. The hoofprints had walked straight up to the house, near one of the side windows, then vanished. With a tad bit of disappointment, the small group of people looked around and found no further trace of the trail. But thinking perhaps some of the snow from the roof had fallen and covered the missing path, a few of them thought to run around side the house to take a look and see if they could spot more. Those left behind where the hoof tracks ended stood and asked one another what the other thought this creature could be. Perhaps it was the work of a prankster, maybe it was some sort of animal they hadn't known of. A few of the more superstitious and religious folks of the group brought up and maybe joked a little that Satan himself took a stroll through their humble village. Most probably had a pretty good laugh over that thought. After all, the members of their community were devout churchgoers. Surely if Satan wanted to take a trip somewhere, he would have taken a walk in a place much more accepting of him. But that's when one of them got a thought. Thinking back, just several minutes prior, they had encountered the wagon, and the hoofprints weren't obstructed by it. Perhaps with the house, it was a similar scenario. That single person decided to investigate their hunch, and took a few steps backwards to get a better view of the roof. As they looked up, their mouth dropped, and soon the rest of the group left on that side of the house joined that person in their disbelief of what they saw. Donning the roof of the second-story home were the footprints, walking in the same straight line they had been when they were on the ground. The small group fell under a stunned silence, with only the fast and excitable footstomps from the few who had gone around to the other side of the house approaching to report their findings. They had told the rest they too had spotted the hoofprints on the other side of the sloped roof, then more leading off in a straight line on the ground heading out of town. It was at this point most of the group disbanded their quest to find the owner of the hoofprints. With the joking of the devil visiting their town just seconds before, now flooding back into their thoughts, most were worried about following the trail any further, afraid of what they might meet upon reaching the end of it. There were, however, a brave few whose curiosity outweighed their concern for what they might meet. Even with most of the group deserting, there were several who decided it was worth the risk of coming face to face with the devil, and headed out of town and into the frozen countryside. The snow in the field proved to be a difficult hazard for the remaining participants of the group. In their excitement and eagerness to find the culprit, most of the group were ill-equipped to travel through the frozen drifts, but with frozen fingers and numb toes, the small group pushed on. The longer the trail went, the more people decided to turn back. Not everyone was up for a wild goose chase of tracking down a hoofed creature, and some needed to head back home to do chores and go to work. It was a Friday morning after all, and the burdens of everyday life would eventually call everyone back home. Though word got around, and apparently town after town had reported finding these strange hoofprints in the snow walking near their homes as well. Again, they also had said the prints crossed obstacles that weren't really sensible to walk over. A farmer made mention the hooves appeared through one of his fields and close to his barn where, whatever creature it was, seemed to be undeterred as it simply walked over a snow-covered hay bale instead of taking the much easier path of walking around it. Then, in another town, a few more curious citizens decided to follow where the tracks went. They actually found the prints to be much more difficult to track, as the markings in the snow would lead the group to a long, tall wall, where the tracks were found to have simply walked over it with ease. The houses puzzled this second group as well in this town. It took some time for them to figure out where the hoofprints had gone, but upon standing back a bit, they found the creature had walked across several separate sloped rooftops. Back up, then back down. No matter what the obstacle or how many there were, they did not stop whatever it was from getting to its destination, wherever that might be. What had set this second group in this town apart from the first, only a few kilometers away, was that they decided to follow the trail a bit further. Maybe because they were further down the trail than those from the first town, they thought they would meet whatever it was who left these markings. For over an hour, this new party had traveled through the ice-covered farmlands and were headed straight towards a wooded area. But sadly, this is where their journey would end, as a wide river stood between them and the tracks on the other side. That was the last point where the hoofprints were seen, walking into and past the tree line and out of sight. If it was the devil, or a similar creature with 2 hooved feet, they again were unobstructed by the ice-cold frozen river, and were able to wade their way through to reach the other side. The nearest bridge was several kilometers away, and trekking through the snow to reach it, then back again to return to the tracks, was a task none of the people in the group were fond of doing. They decided to cut their losses and make their way back the way they came, turning their back on the mystery of what had left all those hoofprints in the snow last night, and what might have been hiding in those woods just out of sight. The appearance of the satanic tracks left people horrified, and nobody knew where they came from, where they went, or what really had left them. Reports of hoofprints continued to flow in, as within the next couple days it would be known the prints had reached places up to 160 kilometers away, appearing in over 30 populated locations, including in the neighboring county of Dorset. This strange occurrence wouldn't happen again in Devon that winter, and if it had happened since, no one has noticed or bothered reporting it. Most likely, if the mysterious hoofprints did return, they could have simply been overlooked or assumed to be simple animal tracks, which would not even be worth bringing up in conversation. The following May of that same year, a news article was released concerning the mysterious hoofprints that appeared that last winter. It states, "It appears on Thursday night there was a heavy snowfall in the neighborhood of Exeter and the south of Devon. On the following morning, the inhabitants of the above towns were surprised at discovering the footmarks of some strange and mysterious animal endowed with the power of ubiquity, as the footprints were to be seen in all kinds of unaccountable places, on tops of houses and narrow walls, in gardens and courtyards, enclosed by high walls and palings, as well as in open fields. The superstitious go so far as to believe they are the marks of Satan himself, and that great excitement had been produced among all classes may be judged from the fact that the subject has been descanted from the pulpit. The impression of the foot closely resembles that of a donkey's shoe, and measured from 1.5 inches to, in some instances, 2.5 inches across. Here and there it appeared as if cloven, but in generality the steps of the shoe was continuous, and from the snow in the center remaining entire, merely showing the outer crest of the foot, it must have been concave. Whatever was the cause for these prints in the snow might have been, the story gripped the minds of nearly all citizens in both counties of Devon and Dorset. Some would go on to scoff at the idea that they were caused by Satan, but others took this as a sign they needed to abandon their sinful ways and turn to the church, thanks to the constant nudging and words from the church attendees and priests. But the legend itself is strange in its own right, and as the years passed on with no further occurrences taking place in the county, people slowly forgot about the night the devil visited. Still though, those who did remember still feared to be caught outside after midnight, just in case. It wasn't until nearly 100 years later in the 1950s had someone discovered the unsent documents written by the Reverend H.T. Ellicombe, meant to be sent to the Illustrated London News, prefaced with a note instructing not to print the letters. A portion of these letters mentioned these words describing that night. The marks which appeared on the snow and which were seen on Friday morning to all appearances were the perfect impression of a donkey's hoof. The length 4 inches by 2 3/4 inches, but instead of progressing as that an animal would have done, or indeed as any other would have done, feet right and left, it appeared that foot had followed foot in a single line. The distance from each tread being 8 inches or rather more. The foot marks in every parish being exactly the same size and the steps the same length. people still continue to disagree whether or not the hoofprints were in fact left by something supernatural, or rather left by something much more explainable. But as the theories like an animal or human being the cause became more and more unlikely, the citizens of Devon County would collectively name the tracks in the snow as the Devil's Footprints. The Devil's Footprints have baffled both skeptics and believers ever since that fateful freezing winter back in 1855. Even to this day, nobody really knows what it could have been that have left those strange tracks in the snow. Though, there are those who believe they may have found the answers. What's commonly thought among historians and researchers is that the hoofprints in the snow didn't travel as far as the initial claims had suggested. More so that the markings in the snow were just seen in one or two towns, which then the citizens greatly exaggerated the distance of the trail. It's simply believed it's just a complete coincidence that prints of similar shape and size happen to appear in other communities. It's believed they could have been caused by several different things, which we'll get into in just a couple moments, but if this is true, and that the markings were made by something more explainable, it makes the unnerving thought of Lucifer making his rounds in the county seem rather dramatic. But I think we could all understand how these spiritual, church-going villagers from the 1850s might have jumped to the conclusion that the devil had come for a visit. But for those who were able to disconnect themselves from the shared superstitions of their peers, even back then they had alternative theories which were much more based in reality. Word having spread far and wide about the mysterious tracks led many to ponder the origins of them. The Illustrated London News had a field day with the story, sharing and spreading it to all corners of the United Kingdom. And along with the story, they provided a possible and logical cause for what could have happened in Devon just a few weeks prior. Whoever the author was of the article suggested perhaps the hoofprints in the snow were in fact made by an animal, but not one with hooves. The common wood mouse, one of the many species of rodents populating the British countryside, was their suspected culprit for these tracks, hopping through the snow, causing the impact of their fall to create these strange markings. Fairly recently, writer, historian, and researcher Mike Dash, who writes and specializes in strange, little-known events that happened through history, agreed with the same theory made by the Illustrated London News back in 1855, though he decided to expand on the theory a bit. In his paper entitled The Devil's Hoof Marks, Source Material on the Great Devon Mystery of 1855, he concluded the devil's footprints were a hoax from the beginning. Simple superstition took hold of the minds of these villagers at the time, preventing them from thinking logically. Dash believes the footprints left in the snow were simply caused by a quadruped, like a donkey or goat, and that with the added wood mice jumping around after a fresh blanket of snow covering their holes, helped create the illusion of thousands of tracks leading off for what would seem like several kilometers. This theory honestly seems to make the most sense to me, as wood mice hopping through the snow would leave behind identical markings which just so happen to look like hoofprints. With this case happening in a rural area, chances are a donkey or goat, or even that of a roe deer, could have made enough tracks to begin with that the villagers noticed them, then found the wood mouse tracks and believed them to belong to the same creature heading off in a certain direction. Though I will be the first to admit, while this theory seems to make sense, it doesn't explain the reports of markings found on rooftops and areas where a donkey or wood mouse probably wouldn't have ended up, which then would lead us to our next theory. Also mentioned in Mike Dash's paper about the footprints, he makes mention of a British novelist by the name Geoffrey Household. Geoffrey was born 45 years after the events that took place in Devon County, and was fascinated by the tale. After delving into the mystery himself, he thought perhaps the tracks were caused by a runaway balloon from the nearby Devon dockyard. What he believed to happen was because of the harsh winter weather, the balloon had broken free of its tether and drifted through the countryside during the night when nobody would have seen it. Now, possibly attached to the balloon might have been a cord which was used to anchor the balloon in place, but also had iron shackles on the end of the rope which danced along the ground while the balloon blew through the fields and towns. This would then have led the iron shackles, which would have been shaped like horseshoes, to press into the snow lightly to create these imprints. As the balloon drifted along, it would create the trail on the ground. This would also explain the reasoning as to why the markings appeared in unlikely places like rooftops and over walls. Now, this theory seems a little far-fetched for myself, But if we humor it for a second and say that a balloon had drifted across the county from the Devon dockyard, perhaps with the added animal tracks from both donkeys and mice, a few villagers with their religious backgrounds may have overreacted and jumped the gun, as it were, to assume that the devil had visited their towns and incited mass hysteria among the other members of the community. And I'll even add a bit of my own ideas into this theory. If the balloon part of it seems a little too far-fetched, then I might be able to offer up an alternative to it. Now sure, maybe the tracks on the roofs could have been birds making those marks on the snow. It's an easy answer. But from what is reported, those who had gone up to the roofs to check them out claimed they were the same hoof-shaped prints that were on the ground and not likely made from any bird. Well, I have an idea. That because these villages in the County of Devon were quite rural, there would be a lot of farms around the area. If those farms happened to have goats, perhaps it was the goats who were the ones who left the hoof prints, as well as the ones up on the roof. For those who aren't aware of the climbing skills of goats, they are incredibly skilled in getting places you wouldn't expect. Some places that would otherwise be difficult for even a human to reach. I myself have even seen goats climbing up a tree once, and I'm sure anyone could find a picture of a goat or two standing on a rooftop on Google. What I'm thinking is, by sheer coincidence with the hopping of the wood mice in the snow, maybe a small herd of goats, or maybe just one, made their way into town and decided to have some fun and climb up on hay bales, houses, and walls, and then possibly moved on. Then, with the superstitious villagers adding the hysteria, the rest of the town joined their train of thought, even though something much simpler could have explained what they were finding. Over the years, animals being the cause for these tracks have been the prevailing idea among skeptics who set out to solve this mystery. Some have brought up moose, deer, swans, ducks, and even have gone so far as to claim an escaped kangaroo was the cause. All of these explanations, though maybe except for the kangaroo, could all be possible. The only trouble lies with proving that it was in fact an animal who had caused these imprints. With this case happening over 160 years ago, and with little evidence aside from a few sketches and articles of paper describing the event, it makes providing a definite answer for this mystery difficult. With this in mind, it might be impossible for us to determine what actually happened here back in 1855. Could it have been Lucifer himself, taking a midnight stroll through the County of Devon, or much more likely, the random antics of a playful animal? The devil's footprints found in the snow back in 1855 in Devon County are certainly a strange phenomenon. It's not every day something like this happens, and since it hasn't happened again in Devon County, one could assume this mystery has long since closed. That might be true for the citizens here, but it would just so happen that the occurrence of odd hoof-shaped prints in the snow had been found in another location as well. The Illustrated London News reported 15 years prior to the event happening in Devon County about a similar set of mysterious footprints in the snow-covered mountains of Scotland, several hundred kilometers away back in 1840 and 1839. In both years, the hoofprints appeared and in the same manner climbed over unlikely obstacles with zero effort, leaving those who found the markings to be equally as confused as the people in Devon County had been. Although in their article, the news described the prints in the snow as similar to that of being like a hare hopping around, they also made mention the imprints were very deep, leaving some to believe they were created by a heavier creature than that of a hare. With the fact they had followed the trail for nearly 20 kilometers, it cemented the thought in everyone's mind that what happened 15 years prior in Scotland was of the same creature that seemingly appeared in Devon County in 1855. With this being said, as recently as 2013, and in Scotland again, more prints were found in the snow-covered hills. Though many believe these tracks were made by somebody playing a joke on the population, as April Fool's Day was the same day they were found. So, once again, here we are at the end of the episode with two choices. Are the devil footprints of the supernatural origin, created by the infernal hooves of Satan himself? Or did mass hysteria and strong belief play the major role in the birth of this legend? It's up to you to decide which one you believe. But whatever you decide to choose, one thing we can all agree on is how mysterious and abnormal the folklore behind the prints found in the snow at Devon County actually are. With such little evidence aside from a few handwritten letters, news articles, and rough sketches, it makes it increasingly difficult to determine what the truth actually is. But Then again, isn't that what makes the best mysteries? I hope you enjoyed listening to the legend behind the Devil's Footprints. It's an incredibly fascinating story, and I'm so thankful I was able to share it with you all. If you enjoyed this tale, perhaps your friends and family would too. The best way to support the podcast is by sharing it, and I would be incredibly grateful for you doing so. Another way of support is by reviewing the podcast by giving it 5 stars and then hitting the subscribe or follow button. That helps the podcast become more available and present among the podcast charts. If you or anyone you know have a strange story to share about your experience with the paranormal or supernatural, I'd love to hear from you. No matter how big or small, all stories are welcome. And you can get in contact with me by email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram at moonlightlorepodcast, where I post pictures and videos relating to the episodes I talk about on the show. Once again though, I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you've been enjoying the show so far. As always, take care during these difficult times. Keep your lanterns lit and always keep exploring the unknown. I'll see you next time.